Welcome, everybody. It's thrilling to see us back here in the Landfair livery. This is the community programming space for the Watch Hill Conservancy. This is the Chaplain B. Barnes Reading Room. And it's a wonderful place to gather, so thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Deborah Lamb, and I'm the chairman of the Watch Hill Conservancy. And before we move on to tonight's talk, I just want to take a moment to thank our community programming sponsors. They're up here on the screen, I think. They're still there, yes. This year we had 17 businesses and families supporting both our community programming and the care of this lovely space. Their generous support allows us for the robust schedule of programming we've lined up for you this summer season. So please put your hands together and recognize this year's community sponsors. I also want to take a moment to remind you that Monday starts the 7th season of our very popular Monday evening speaker series, Landfair Live. Our first program will be Monday evening, July 15 at 6 p.m., so I hope to see you right back here next Monday night. Our speaker is internationally recognized gemologist Simon Tiekle, and he will be sharing his insight into the pursuit of exceptional gems. It promises to be a fascinating and beautiful presentation with lots of eye candy, so I hope that you can be here next Monday night. And before I move on to my introduction of Tom, I do want to take a minute to recognize the amazing Conservancy staff that does everything that we need to be here presenting tonight. And we have 2 new members of our team that I want to make sure to point out to you. So we have a new executive director at the Watch Hill Conservancy. You may have seen some messages from her, Barbara Axmacher. Could you please raise your hand and introduce yourself? Thank you. And at the hospitality table, we have our new office manager, Becky Wilson. Becky, would you raise your hand out there? Thank you so much. And of course, we've got Peter August, Janice Sassy, Dan Cole in the back of the room, and I think he's invisible at this moment, Tom Papadilla, who does everything that you can't imagine needs to be done, as well as man the entrance to Napatree, which is where most of you probably know him from. So tonight, we're thrilled to welcome to Watch Hill our friends and colleagues at the Westerly Historical Society for a presentation about the history of Fort Mansfield. Tonight's speaker, historian Jack Spratt, and Historical Society President Tom Galushko came to us this winter to preview the presentation, and we jumped on it and set a date. Thank you both for partnering with the Conservancy on this. And without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce my friend, the president of the Westerly Historical Society, Tom Galushko.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And again, Tom Galushko, president of the Westerly Historical Society. Welcome everybody this evening to our presentation on Fort Mansfield, a history presented by our friend, esteemed researcher, Captain Jack Spratt. Before we started tonight, you were treated to a brief segment of our new project, which is Reflections. It's an oral history program that we have identified, or are in the process of identifying, 24 subjects aged 80 years young or older who have been born and raised and lived their life pretty much in the Westerly community that want to share their life stories. How certain world events affected daily life here in Westerly, and from elementary school to raising their family and whatnot. We have 3 done so far. That's what you were treated to, segments of them tonight. We're looking for sponsorship for this program for the next 2 years. If anybody's interested, you can stop at our table and see Ed or Zach. They'd be willing to give you some more information on it. I did want to reiterate to the audience that, like Deborah said, Barbara and Becky have been a great addition to the Watch Hill Conservancy. They've been very helpful in putting this together and making sure it goes very smooth. Peter August as well. Thank you, Peter, for all your help. A sincere appreciation to Jennifer and Alan Britton from Braceale Brewery and South County Distillery, who never miss an opportunity to join us and help keep you hydrated with their liberations. So believe it or not, there is a great deal of work that goes into what we do in a project such as this. I hope you can enjoy the full extent of it when it's out and released to the public. We continue to seek the support of the community, and if there's anybody here in the audience, we have not filled out our 24 subjects yet. So if you fit the criteria, if you're 80 years young or older, you've been born and raised in Westerly and are very comfortable telling your story, please join us. And now for a real treat, I'm pleased to introduce Captain Jack Spratt with his program on Fort Mansfield.
Good evening. I greatly respect and appreciate those that took time to preserve, write, and photograph our history. Clement A. Grissom's book, Fort Mansfield, Napatree Point, Watch Hill, which was published actually by the Westerly Historical Society, is a great example, as is the early landholders of Watch Hill by Reginald Peck, Watch Hill Then and Now by Ardith Schneider and Rebecca Burkhart, and Watch Hill Through Time by Chap Barnes. I also, there's a series of images in it's about a third of my collection, and I really appreciate the fact that the photographers of Watch Hill documented the history of Watch Hill, and it's really a fascinating journey to walk through that. My goal with these historical presentations is to make information and images available so that those that have an interest in history or are looking for some information, that it's readily available to them. And I really do this also to support and to bring together the wonderful Westerly institutions with the wonderful Watch Hill institutions, whether it be the library or the Historical Society. And they include the Lighthouse Keepers Association, the Westerly Library, the Watch Hill Improvement Society, and certainly the Conservancy. Watch Hill Life editorial, July 1898. Quote, "It may be news for Watch Hill people that the hill is included in the government plan to fortify the eastern end of Long Island Sound. A tract of 60 acres was purchased on Napatree. Fort Mansfield, named in honor of Civil War Major General Joseph Mansfield, who died at Antietam, was established in 1898 on 60 acres of land on Napatree and Sandy Point, Watch Hill. By 1901, it was garrisoned with 30 men and 2 8-inch disappearing and 2 5-inch rapid fire guns. Its armament was removed in 1917. The property was put up for sale in 1926 and sold in January of 1928. To a Watch Hill syndicate, the Napatree Corporation. The fort buildings were razed December of 1928, with the only remnants, the C bulkhead and the 3 concrete batteries. It was a United States Army Coast Artillery fort designed to prevent foreign Navy shallow draft torpedo boats, cruisers, gunboats, and landing craft from entering Fisher's Island Sound through the Strait of Watch Hill. That's a picture coming from the fort. Part of a network of artillery posts at the eastern end of Long Island Sound, along an 18-mile line of islands from Orient Point, New York to Napatree, designed to protect the port cities of Long Island Sound in New York and Connecticut, and the city of New York. The sinking of the USS Maine on February 15, 1898 profoundly impacted Watch Hill, if for not the Spanish-American War, which was April 21st to December 10th, 1898, the United States government would never have bought land on Napatree, and we would not have a fort. Over the past 123 years, with the threat to the Naps from hurricanes, winter storms, and erosion, I wonder what the point would look like without the remaining massive 2 cement batteries. I suspect that Napatree would be very different than it is today. To be sure, Watch Hill cottage owners, hotel proprietors, and merchants were not happy to host a military artillery fort. Watch Hill has played a critical but supporting role in conflicts throughout history. The Great Bank, as it was called and depicted in this 1876 painting, served as one of a series of 12 watch post warning stations from New London, Fisher's Island to Providence that received and relayed alerts along the coast in the event of an attack by sea. The Great Bank became known as Watch Point as it was used as a watch and signal station during the Pequot Wars 1636 to 8, King Philip's War 1675 to 76, and the pirate raids in the 18th century. Watch stations consisted of a firebox atop a pole burning pitch and bale hay. The fires could be seen by night and the smoke by day, relaying warning point to point up the coastline during the King Philip's War, the French and Indian War 1754 to 63, and the American Revolutionary War. In 1777, Her Majesty's ship Lark surveyed the eastern passages into Long Island Sound in New York. Note that Watch Hill was designated as Watch Point on the chart. From the North Fork of Long Island on the lower left, across the Horse Race, Plum Island, it's called Gull Rock, which was Great Gull and Little Gull Islands, to Fisher's Island and over to Napatree Point, the 18 miles. The British blockaded this area during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and it was understood that this natural gate of islands could keep ships in with a blockade and with cannons keep hostile navies out. During the War of 1812 to 1814, the British blockade of the eastern passage of Long Island Sound demonstrated the strategic importance of a line of defense from Orient Point to Watch Hill. Commodore Stephen Decatur's fleet, fleeing from New York through Long Island Sound, was forced to escape capture from the British Navy by taking refuge up the Thames River to Gales Ferry, just across from the Yale Boathouse. And he stayed there and was boxed in for the remainder of the war. This is actually a hand-drawn hydrographic survey that was prepared for Sir Thomas Harding. During the Battle of Stonington in August of 1814, Westerly's militia removed the watch house signal post from the Great Bank to Sunset Hill, adding a Patriot battery as depicted in this painting. Sunset Hill, at a greater elevation than Watch Point, had a commanding view of the Ocean Bay River in Napatree, offering a better line of sight with Block Island, Stonington, Fisher's Island, and Groton for signals while providing better protection from the elements and the enemy. It should be noted that more than one hill was used as a lookout during these wars. Although the Watch Hill to Fisher's Island Strait has a series of reefs that would limit the tonnage of warships entering Fisher's Island Sound, the port towns of Stonington, Mystic, Groton, and New London could still be captured by small craft, as the British unsuccessfully attempted to do during the Revolution and during the War of 1812. Therefore, defensive fortifications were needed to cover the entrance to Fisher's Island Sound, either on the Watch Hill shore or on the Fisher's Island east end. After 1814, Napatree was used regularly by the Westerly Rifle Company for target shooting. For example, in 1856, the Westerly Rifle Company, numbering 58 men, was escorted by the Westerly Brass Band to the steamer Liberty, which docked off Main Street for the excursion down to Watch Hill. The military report titled Defense of Maritime Frontiers in 1854 set forth, quote, the importance and strategic value of placing steam batteries from Orient Point to Watch Hill to form an important and imposing obstacle line of defense to the occupancy of these waters. From August through the fall of 1860, Watch Hill's East Beach became the testing grounds for the United States Army's rifled cannon trials using General James from Rhode Island rifled artillery. Quote, the newly invented rifle cannon, which is now being tried at Watch Hill, has been fired 6 times. The target is a board 20 feet long and 10 feet high and is 6 mile distance. The worst shot came within 6 feet of the corner of the target, July 11th, 1860, New London Star. The examination of the James rifled artillery at Watch Hill and the adoption of the rifled cannon and projectiles in the Civil War changed the design of future coastal fortifications from walled masonry castles to low-profile earthen structures, as proven by the destruction and surrender of Fort Pulaski, Georgia, in April of 1862. The 1860 James Cannon trials on East Beach led to the design of Fort Mansfield on Napatree 38 years later. So what did Napatree look like before the fort? The powerful Great September Gale of 1815, a hurricane, had a dramatic impact on Napatree and Sandy Point. It destroyed the nap of trees at the point and changed the shape of these barrier beaches. Unfortunately, there are no paintings from this period. We know from the historical record that Napatree and Sandy Point were so close to Stonington Borough that Watch Hill residents went to church, married, and traded with Stonington more than they did with Westerly. We also know Napatree and Sandy Point were used to harvest fish and had a salt works. This is an image from Napatree, the bathing beach, circa 1870s. This is 1870s looking the opposite direction. You can see from left to right, you can see the Narragansett House, the Ocean House, the Atlantic House, the original Watch Hill House, and the Larkin House in 1869 before its expansion. This is 10 years later in the 1880s, and if you look closely, you can see a woman, a Victorian dress, sitting on the beach. And now the Larkin House has extended, and you can always tell what that is by the second tower. Dave Larkin's house on Napatree, actually at the point, was built in around 1868. The government contractor, Curtis, out of New Britain, subcontracting with the Maxim and Company of Westerly, relocated the house further east on the beach in 1898 to construct the 8-inch gun battery, Worcester. Italian workers under their Irish boss, W.H. Connor, who independently provided workers, mostly from New London, dug by hand a 30-foot trench directly behind where the Larkin House stood for the Worcester gun battery. 1880s Larkin's home is on the point. You can see it. The Peninsula Hotel, which is in the middle, and Dave Larkin himself is working assigned nets as part of his fish factory on Sandy Point. This is Napatree Bathing Beach. Note the Peninsula House. This is the Larkin Beach Pavilion in the 1890s. The Peninsula House is now the Halcyon House. This is the entrance to Napatree, known as Haggardtown. It was the home to the haggard-looking poor fishermen's families and the temporary shacks of some of the Italian fort workers. This is a survey map of Watch Hill and Napatree. If you notice the chimney on Napatree in the drawing, the Peninsula House, the Block Island Steamer Pier. By 1880, America's military and port cities' defensive fortifications were from the Civil War or earlier eras. These masonry castles armed with smoothbore Rodman guns were no match for the modern navies of Europe with advanced warships and armaments. President Cleveland ordered a review of America's coast defenses under Secretary of War William Endicott to address these weaknesses. In 1886, the report of the Board on Fortifications or Other Defenses, known as the Endicott Report, and updated in 1905 by order of President Theodore Roosevelt under the Secretary of War William Taft, 27th President. In the report of the National Coast Defense Board, known as the Taft Board, presented a detailed plan of defense using the Endicott and Taft weapons, which were highly accurate. These included disappearing cannons, mortars, rapid-fire guns, submarine nets, underwater mines, and searchlights. The guns were between 3 inches to 12 inches in caliber and had a range of 7 to 9 miles. The modern age began with concrete and electricity, rifled cannons that were breech-loaded versus muzzle-loaded, the use of steel versus iron, enabling cannons to be much stronger and replacing gunpowder with propellants that burn slowly, therefore giving cannons greater range and control, being used in defenses for the first time. The advances in military hardware, tactics, and technology during the first decades of the 20th century ultimately made coast artillery fixed fortifications obsolete. The board identified 27 harbor cities, New York being ranked number 1, Boston number 3, Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay 11, and New Haven in Connecticut number 27. Funding for the actual construction of a modest building program began in 1890 under the direction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Work began on the eastern or backdoor entrance to Long Island Sound in New York on November 27, 1896 at Great Gull Island, which was Fort Mikey, and Fort Terry at Plum Island in 1887. No plans existed at this time for a fort on Napatree or Gardiner's Island. Panic. Where is the Spanish fleet? The headline read, quote, Spain's fleet reported to be headed towards the northeast. The Evening Tribune, Pawcatuck, Rhode Island, April 25th, 1898, the day the United States declared war on Spain. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, Cuba on February 15th, 1898 was a pivotal moment that contributed to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, April 21st to December 10th, 1898, 10 weeks. As the Spanish Armada was believed to be headed for the northeast coast of the United States, a sense of urgency and tension gripped the nation. Public officials responding to the public's panic demanded immediate action, intensifying the implementation and funding of the Endicott artillery fortifications and armament. At Napatree, the government secretly purchased an option for $150 to buy 3 tracts of land on Napatree, the Thompson brothers, the Schroeder heirs, and W.H. Hill. An inspector for the United States Service by the name of Henry B. Gorham was used to avoid public hearings and community pushback, closing on the 60 acres on April 6, 1889. The government's difficulty securing property on Fisher's Island for Fort Wright in March of 1886 resulted in the government taking by eminent domain 250 acres. Major Smith Leach of the Army Corps of Engineers was in command of fort construction on Plum Island, Great Gull Island, Gardiner's, Fisher's Island, and Napatree. Leach had grave reservations about building Fort Mansfield and Fort Tyler on barrier beaches subject to erosion, flooding. Before the legal issues acquiring land at Fisher's Island for Fort Wright, Leach and others preferred to guard the Watch Hill Strait, building gun batteries on the eastern end of Fisher's Island, not on Napatree. Overnight, the West Stonington Harbor breakwater was fitted with a Rodman smoothbore cannon. A detachment of 30 men from Battery B, heavy artillery, under Lieutenant Leonard from Fort Trumbull, New London, was sent to bivouac in tents on Napatree to defend Stonington using the recently installed cannon. The cannon, by the way, lasted a year and then rusted away. Without the Spanish-American War, a fort would never have been built at Watch Hill. And here's some important dates to think about. April 2nd, 1889, an option's taken out for Napatree, land on Napatree for $150. April 25th, 98, Congress declares war. On July 3rd, U.S. forces destroy the Spanish fleet, and on July 3rd, at Watch Hill, the government takes possession of 60 acres of Napatree, paying $5,500. Once the government starts down a path, I guess it's hard to get them to stop. This is a picture of the Westerly militia marching off to the Spanish-American War. The design of the 18-mile outer line eastern defenses of New York took advantage of geography. In 1888, the Journal of Military Service Institute reported on the importance of a defensive line between Orient Point and Watch Hill. The defense of New York against approaches from the east is between Montauk, New York, and Point Judith. If this entrance is made secure, New York and the port cities of Long Island Sound will be guarded against all naval attacks from the east. The horse race between Little Gull Island and Fisher's Island is 4 miles, with strong tides up to 6 miles per hour. The strait between eastern Fisher's Island and Napatree Point is not navigable to large ships, and the channel is so tortuous that if the buoys were removed, strangers could not use it. A few mines would close it. The important thing to take away from this is that by 1900, the technology wasn't advanced enough to have 16-inch cannon that could cover from Montauk Point to Point Judith. So therefore, the backup was to actually use the race for that purpose. The first order of business was to create access to the land. On August 3rd, 1898, Major Smith Leach, chief engineer, sent out an RFP for the construction of a pier at the northwest point of Napatree. The specifications were a pile dock 30 feet wide and 400 feet long. Quote, within 10 days after the contract is awarded, the contractor must drive 10 piles a day and complete the superstructure as fast as possible. The work must be completed inside of 30 days. Neglect to complete the work by the time specified means forfeiture of 50%, end quote. Not many people wanted to bid on that. On August 14, 1898, the famous Captain Thomas A. Scott, a wrecker and heroic diver out of New London, the only bidder for the government contract, began driving 100 chestnut spiles. The top of the wharf was designed to be 7 feet above low water, and the deck was double planked and fastened with heavy bolts to withstand heavy seas from the southeast. The work required 23 men, 2 derrick scows loaded with lumber, and a pile driver under the foreman, Frederick Copeland. Bringing materials, supplies, water, cannon, and men to the fort dock was challenging. At the time, there was no road out to the fort from Watch Hill. Often the seas were too rough and the water too thin for vessels other than barges or light steamers. For example, lumber for the naps was furnished by the Chappell Company out of New London and shipped aboard the schooner Henry H. Chamberlain. The captain of the Chamberlain refused to run the ship to the wharf, stating the Chamberlain draws 10.2 feet, hardly a safe thing to do. Therefore, the lumber had to be offloaded onto a steam barge for delivery. The construction of the 3-gun batteries in the fall of 1898 and the spring of 1899 required 12,000 barrels of cement, equal to 250 cement truckloads, from the Rosedale and Atlas companies, delivered by steam canal boats. A Mr. Keyes of Westerly contracted to provide 7,000 tons of crushed stone, equivalent to 500 dump trucks full. All material supplies and manpower delivered by barge. The design of the Seacoast Gun Battery includes a parapet based on the General James trial in Watch Hill in 1860, which included large boulders surrounded by cut stone and covered with soil against a blast slope. The loading platform, battery parade, and guns on mounts are also included in the image provided. By the winter of 1899, the foundation for both the 8-inch disappearing gun and the 5-inch rapid fire guns were completed. Plans for building a mortar battery were abandoned. Wallace L. Hale was contracted to do the wiring for the electrical work. This is 2 things that you probably see and wonder what they are. Off of the point is a breakwater, which was created to protect the wharf, and you can see the remnants of the fort. It's a statement for chestnut pilings. A small gauge rail was built. By July 1901, a detachment of 30 men permanently were assigned to the fort, but they only were housed in one single barracks under Sergeant Sullivan. This is a picture of the actual engine. A fort expansion plan was passed by Congress, and the Curtis Company again was awarded the contract, which they again subcontracted to the Maxim Company, for 17 new buildings that had to be completed by January 1902. Fresh water had to be shipped in by boat, even though a contractor drilled down 400 feet and came up empty. In 1902, a water main was connected to the westerly water system, which is a major improvement. The first installation of searchlights took place in 1902. In 1904, the big 60-inch searchlights were added. To the left is the fort property, including Sandy Point. The top right shows the parade grounds, the wharf, the Battery, Crawford, and Worcester. The bottom left is the coal shed, followed by the bakehouse, temporary barracks for the National Guard troops and West Point cadets, the ordnance building, workshop, barracks, administration building, battery connel, and bulkhead. In the bottom right is the guardhouse, barracks, the non-commissioned officers' housing, the hospital, and the officers' quarters. In 1898, the Army focused on putting up the gun batteries as fast as possible. The barracks were not completed until the summer of 1902 and were only designed for 30 men, the initial complement from Fort Trumbull. By 1904, the barracks were expanded to hold 100 soldiers and house the 88th Coast Artillery Company. A campground area was available for tents for an additional 30. Before the barracks were completed, the men slept in tents. The cold winter of 1898-99 was particularly uncomfortable for the workers and the soldiers. Battery Connell, with its two 5-inch guns on carriage mounts pointing at the lighthouse. This battery was lightly built on the beach and is now offshore as the beach has receded north. Battery Crawford's 5-inch guns on balance carriage was located west of the 8-inch guns. Note the telephone to communicate with the plotting room to the left. This is Battery Crawford again. And this is the 8-inch gun. The 8-inch disappearing gun is in its retracted position. In the middle of the image is the fire control tower. The lower level is the plotting room, which uses additional range-bearing stations to triangulate the position of enemy ships. The gun is pointed as far left as it can go before hitting the concrete wall. This limited the gun from firing further east than the lighthouse, which was by design. The fire control system's purpose was to observe enemy ships, estimate their positions, calculate firing data for guns directed to hit those targets, assess the effectiveness of such fire, and make corrections where necessary using horizontal range finding. The main observation tower and the range sighting post triangulated the enemy's position. Top left is a depression rangefinder azimuthscope. Top right is the 60-inch searchlight that was used to find the enemy, and then the searchlight was used to keep the spotlight on it for the artillery to see how they were doing. The bottom left is the plotting room. The bottom right is the observation station, plotting room and B station and B2 station. This is the lighthouse, and the little building in front is the fire control post that was used for the triangulation. The Worcester battery on the left is the magazine level. You can see with the davits that were used to lift the heavy artillery ammunition. The 8-inch gun is next. The soldiers are climbing stairs from the magazine level to the gun platform, and below is a diagram of how the disappearing gun recoil blast forces the gun back and down below the battery wall. This is critical. It was great because during the Civil War, it was muzzle loading from the front, so it had the artillerymen exposed. This design was that the gun actually, when it went off, actually kicked back and went down. So it was below the parapet of the fortification. The negative part about that is that these cannon couldn't, on this platform, couldn't elevate to a very high level. But they were breech loaded, which meant that they were loaded from the back. And this only could happen because of the technology in terms of the metallurgy to be able to use steel versus iron. This is, everybody like to mug on the 8-inch gun, but you can see clearly here the mechanism, pretty amazing. And this is, I'm not sure if it's someone's kid or just a kid that kind of happened onto the fort. This is a bad image, but it's from the Providence paper. It's the guardhouse at the entrance to the fort. Mail was delivered twice a day by Cy Cottrell on his mule. From Battery Worcester, this is where the 8-inch gun was, looking back towards Watch Hill. Note the second fort pier in Little Narragansett Bay. If you look over to the left, there's a boat and then there's a pier there. So there was actually 2 docks on Napatree Point. There actually was 3 because the Peninsula House had a dock, and when the steamers would come in, if you know Denison Rock, that was a point so that they would come in and come around to be able to get the Peninsula Wharf. And then they would either go to Watch Hill or they'd come back from Watch Hill that way. That dock was destroyed by ice. This is looking towards Battery Worcester, so now we're looking in the opposite direction. We're looking now back at the end of Napatree. In the foreground is the bakehouse. Across from that is the coal shed. You can see the 2 tent areas to accommodate the Coast Artillery National Guard companies from New York and Connecticut. And you see the second site, which also was for the West Point cadets when they did their artillery training. The training that took place for the guards in West Point continued right up until 1916. Water came to the fort in 1902 after the water lines were brought in for the Watch Hill Fire District. This is the hospital. It was expanded in 1904. This is the main barracks. This is the commandant's quarters, Rafferty, and that's his carriage. This is the guardhouse and barracks, and you can also see the platform, which was used to spot as kind of as a lookout. The seawall, storms, especially southeast storms, cause significant erosion and flooding. The fort buildings on a regular basis. In 1903, a seawall was built by the Thomas Scott Company for $10,000. The remains of the post of the bulkhead are, if you walk out on Napatree on the ocean side or the Block Island Sound side, you'll see 3 posts that are sitting out there. Everybody thinks they're a dock. They're actually part of this structure that you can see in front of this building on the left-hand side, which was a seawall, a bulkhead, if you will. The remains of the post of the bulkhead, remnants of the bulkhead washed up on shore from that big storm we had this winter, and I tend to go out on Napatree to look for stuff, and this is actually washed up on land, and you can see the bolts and the structure of this bulkhead. This is a view of the temporary barracks for the National Guard troops, the ordnance building, the barracks, and the administration building. This here is soldiers drilling in front of the barracks. The view is looking towards Watch Hill. Note again the seawall, how close it is to the sidewalk. These are soldiers at ease. If you look closely, you'll see the observation tower in the background. Fort life. The Italian workmen were grossly underpaid. Their living conditions deplorable. They went on strike over food rations. The government had no control over the plight of the workers as they were contracted out to a company in New London. The Italian workers were supervised by their Irish boss, Connor. In 1899, a Swedish worker drowned when he took a boat going for supplies and the boat flipped over. The day reported on the fort life, quote, "For the soldiers it was drill, drill, drill. The men's cots are arranged around the sides of the big room of the barracks. Communication is frequent with the outside world. A launch comes nearly every day from headquarters while the pair of mules and the big black wagon goes to town at low tide. Mail is delivered several times per day. The walk on the beach when the tide is out is not bad, but it's leg tiring when the water is high. To obviate this, a patch of planks has been laid along the top of the ridge from the reservation's eastern boundary to the barracks. This makes a fairly good walk, although it must be rather deceptive and on dark nights. For amusement, the men have plenty of reading material and games. They also have a couple of small boats in which they can sail and fish. The government provides them with substantial food, while the post exchange supplies them with the luxuries of life. The men do not have an opportunity to get lonesome, for with their duties they are kept tolerably busy. An off day is a rarity. This is, end quote, this is the day, July 24th, 1902. It must have been more challenging than the article suggests, because in 1902, within 2 months, 2 soldiers committed suicide using their service weapons. In 1908, a soldier drowned, but with the expansion of the fort reservation, life became vibrant. Officers brought families to live on the base and drove their children to school in carriages. Soldiers got married in Watch Hill and had their receptions at the hotels. And the Watch Hill community sponsored parties, invited officers and their wives. The 88th Company baseball team played against the Watch Hill Ivies and beat them regularly. Football and bowling were popular with the men. Yes, there were bar fights and disorderly behavior by the enlisted men in the village. The IMPS, the Watch Hill Improvement Society, successfully lobbied for more police presence, and a 2,000-pound jail was assembled in the village. This is a view looking west, the cottages, the Halcyon House, formerly the Peninsula House Hotel, and the fort buildings. In 1902, just as the fort was being completed, the military tested the effectiveness of the gun emplacements and used the exercises for troop training and stress testing to determine if any changes would be necessary to make the defensive line stronger. The majority of Fort Trumbull, New York, 88th Company Coast Artillery under the command of Captain Peterson were assigned to Fort Mansfield. The Navy brought to bear the North Atlantic Fleet, including 5 battleships, 6 cruisers, 3 gunboats, and tenders. The 1902 Mimic War was the first time that the Navy and the Army Coast Artillery conducted realistic maneuvers. The North Atlantic Squadron during the 1902 Mimic War is seen off of Watch Hill. The fleet bypassed Fort Mansfield because the battleships and cruisers could not get through the narrow passages and the shallow depths of the sea. The Navy considered sending small boats for land invasion. However, they calculated that trying to breach the Watch Hill Fisher's Island Strait would fail. The image on the left is actually the gunfire from the forts. The image on the left, bottom, and the right are the battleships. This is the reason why I did this work, because I've always felt bad for the rap that Fort Mansfield got, because even though all of the facts are correct, the reasons why are very different, that it was put into caretaker status. So in 1907, a second Navy-Army Mimic War was conducted on the eve of the Great White Fleet's world voyage meant to project Americans' maritime strength. The dead angle is a large area to the east of Watch Hill Point where there is enough depth to float a battleship, and the guns of the fort cannot reach. This time, Fort Mansfield was attacked, and the results were controversial. The Army claimed victory and the Navy claimed otherwise. The Army Coast Artillery Commander, with headquarters now at Fisher's Island, made a report with the following conclusions. I see no way for the fort to help itself, and I believe that I could capture Fort Mansfield with a fleet of coal barges equipped with 6-inch guns. This was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Parkhurst, the commander of Fort Wright and the Artillery District of New London, August 1906 through March 1909. The images show the 18-inch gun in question in its down position rotated as far down the east beach as possible. If it turned any more, it would hit the concrete wall, thus the blind spot. By 1907, the Army separated the Coast Artillery Companies into a standalone corps, which continued until 1950 when coastal fortifications were made obsolete due to modern warfare technology. The Coast Artillery batteries never had enough artillery-trained soldiers to man all of the batteries. Only 30 to 45% of gun batteries nationwide had enough manpower. The military relied heavily on state guardsmen to man these forts. Fort Mansfield was used extensively for artillery training of New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and other state guards, and was used for training of West Point cadets up until 1916. The Mimic War Games of 1907 were designed to test the readiness of the State Coast Artillery Guards. Army regulars were on hand to provide the training required of these weekend warriors with little or no training themselves. On the other hand, the Navy was using mine planters, significantly smaller and with a much shorter draft than battleships, as you can see the difference on the slide, to act as a battle group of battleships of a much deeper draft. In 1907, Naval Fleet had 1 transport steamer and 3 minesweepers. The analysis of the war maneuvers of 1907 by the U.S. Navy Institute had the following conclusions. Quote, the Navy had studied the coast forts and had, since the War of 1812, been interested in the fortifications of the race, the portal to our greatest naval base, Long Island Sound. As a consequence of this, the coast artillery was tested more severely during the maneuvers than it would be in actual war. For no foreign navy can be supposed to have the intimate knowledge of our coast and forts that our own navy possessions, nor would it concentrate all its efforts in one region. The conclusion is that no foreign battleship would dare come that close to East Beach or all the way down to Noyes Neck, which is what, in fact, the 1907 maneuvers claim that they did. But they weren't in battleships. They were in mine planters. So the naval officers had conducted tabletop war games on the attack of eastern Long Island fortifications for a very long time, while the defending army at the forts had very little or no knowledge of how to man the guns and work the range-finding equipment. The Signal Corps initially could not communicate with the picket boats or the fortification guarding the Watch Hill Fisher's Island Strait. They moved their wireless station against standing orders not to interfere with the hotel businesses to the front of the Watch Hill House Hotel, and they successfully demonstrated the effectiveness of wireless communication. The National Guard officers and men had little practical experience in coast artillery procedures or how to guard against the land invasion from the east. They had little knowledge of the terrain, the beach, or the ocean depths just offshore. To make matters worse, they were hindered by a throng of spectators from the hotels and day trippers. 1,000 excursionists came by steamboats that advertised trips to Watch Hill to see the war games. The Army was also restricted in its ability to move about the hill because of cottages and hotels. At the end of the day, it would have been extremely unlikely that a foreign battleship would come close to the shoreline to be out of the angle of the 8-inch guns on Napatree. The actual battleship squadron in 1902 had determined that the risk-reward of sending small boats through the gauntlet of Fisher's Island Sound was not advisable. The 1907 war maneuvers was unsatisfactory to both the Army and the Navy, as it did little to advance the defenses. The positive outcome of the 1907 Mimic War was the realization that guardsmen needed significantly more training at the forts. Fort Mansfield became a vital reservation for the next 9 years. At the close of the games, General Frederick Grant, the commander of the Department of the East and son of General and President Ulysses S. Grant, made an inspection of Fort Mansfield and addressed the issue of the potential enemy taking advantage of the dead angle of the Worcester 8-inch guns and a plan to repel an amphibious landing on the beaches to the east. He reported that all that was needed was a mortar battery and a company of infantry stationed along the beach. If you recall, when they built Fort Mansfield, they decided not to put in the mortar battery. On July 1st, 1909, the Watch Hill Life Bulletin asked if Watch Hill was quiet. The Hill was again up in arms about the noise of the cannon fire at all times of the night and day. The complaints went to congressmen and to the Army Command. Just after the panic of 1898, the Watch Hill community lobbied for the fort to be closed, citing the impact on the hotel business and the quiet enjoyment of the cottagers, and the issues of drunken soldiers at the hotel bars. A 1914 Army review proved Major Leach's concerns back in 1898 about the wisdom of building an artillery fort on barrier beaches. Fort Tyler on Gardner Island, North Barrier Beach, was never armed or garrisoned, and Fort Mansfield was not considered for an important upgrade in 1914. Congress had passed legislation for the modernization of the coast artillery fortifications. As technology was rapidly changing, for example, starting in 1911, airplanes were put to use for reconnaissance and aerial combat. The plan for Fort Mansfield was to add 16-inch guns and mortar batteries. The report concluded, quote, that Fort Mansfield, not being on an island, was more susceptible to being taken by land attack. Therefore, apart from the cost of a site, the eastern end of Fisher's Island is to be preferred, end quote. The result was that Fort Mansfield was not upgraded. At this time, the fort remained in temporary caretaker status, with 11 soldiers assigned to maintain the equipment and the guns. Throughout the summers of 1914 to 1916, Fort Mansfield was used for summer artillery maneuvers. This is a government photograph from the National Archives, and the military planners in 1920 developed plans actually for an amphibious air base using Fort Mansfield in the calm waters of Little Narragansett Bay for float boats. In the 1960s, plans were proposed for a series of bridges from Orient Point across Plum, Great and Little Gull Islands, and Fisher's Island across to Napatree and connecting to I-95 through Watch Hill. Manning coastal fortifications were a huge expense. As gun technology improved, guns of 16 inches could defend from Point Judith to Montauk, and therefore the focus was to concentrate on larger posts. By 1911, the Coast Artillery Corps only had 30% of the men necessary to man the guns throughout the country. The War Department significantly decreased the number of coast artillery forts in active status. Fort Mansfield was one of many, many forts that were brought into caretaker status. Mansfield was designated a sub-post of Fort Wright, Fisher's Island, and placed in the custody of a caretaker detachment of between 11 and 17 soldiers. The guns were removed in anticipation that they would be needed in Europe during World War I. The fort then became inactive and in permanent caretaker status with 6 soldiers. In fact, those soldiers were involved with the life-saving station crew in extinguishing the Great Fire of 1916 that took out the big hotels above the hill there, the new Watch Hill House, the Atlantic House, and part of the Columbia House where the tea room is. A proposal to use the fort in Little Narragansett Bay as a flying boat base never moved forward. By 1925, it was decided to abandon the fort and put the property with buildings up for sale. By the end of its usefulness, the government had purchased additional land in 1903 and in 1909, bringing the total acreage up to 98.1 acres from 60 acres. These are some of the photographs that were taken for the sale. This is the Battery Worcester. It looks a little different today. Fort Mansfield was sold at auction for either $306,000 in cash or $365,000 with a mortgage that was going to be held by the Washington Trust Bank. This happened on January 26, 1928. To the left at the bottom is what was known as the Amen Corner on the front lawn of the Ocean House, and above that, to the right, is the leaders of the syndicate, the Napatree Corporation, which led the purchase of the government property so that a developer would not turn it into Coney Island or Rye Beach or a bungalow colony. They paid 333% above the appraised value, and they sold 50 shares of the corporate stock for $1,000 a share. December 30th, 1928, Fort Mansfield the buildings were razed. The corporation went bankrupt during the Depression, and the Washington Trust Company Bank held the mortgage. In August of 1931, Frank Coy, a local real estate broker and investor, purchased at auction the property for $100,000. This is actually the the plan that Frank Coy put forth for the development of Napatree Point, which looked a lot like the original plan that the syndicate was trying to avoid. There were 34 lots on the old fort property. Sandy Point was sold to Alfred Gildersleeve of Stonington, Connecticut in 1940. The Gildersleeve family gave Sandy Point to the Avalon Land Conservancy in 1982 to protect and use it as a nature preserve. Today it's part of the Stewart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge. 70 miles of coastal preserves of salt marshes and islands protecting endangered birds and plants. These images are from the decade before the 1938 hurricane. In March 12, 1937, the Day newspaper reported that 2 men were arrested for stealing 2 tons of iron from the abandoned fort. A year later, the Great September Hurricane of 1938 destroyed the homes that were there and called the Long Island Express. And as you know, 15 people perished. This is Peter's slide. It's a great slide, and I'm really thankful he put this together. But this really shows you what's happened to Napatree. As a barrier beach, it rolls over on itself. And so all of the fort buildings you can see are now offshore. Thank you, Peter. So to the left is and if you walk out on Napatree, and I want to emphasize that the gun emplacements, all of the 2 of them, are now fairly dangerous. There's no barriers to protect people. The concrete is really in bad shape, and it's really not advisable to go out there, and it's all full of ticks and poison ivy. So I'm going to show you some photographs of it. So the left picture is the concrete from the wharf. The next is the waste pipes. And then the next 2 slides are the practice bombs from World War II from the Charlestown aviators, including George H.W. Bush, who trained there. Never pick up one of these. Even though they're small and they actually had dye in them, but they have a charge to them so that when they land that they blow up. So if you do go out there and see them or kids playing with them, please call the fire department or call 911, because the bomb squad will go out there and they will take care of them. And there's still quite a few of them out there. This is a aerial photograph from Kevin Rogers that was done in 2015 to give you a sense of what it looks like. This is what it looks like now. And you can see it's really in bad shape. And you could be walking along and not see that there was an area of the concrete that was weak and you could fall and fall through. And I can tell you from being in the fire department, it's not easy to get out and rescue somebody out on the point. So that's it.